You ever come across an airplane that makes you go, man, this is actually genius, and then wonder why nobody bought it? That's the Skymaster. On paper, this thing solved one of the biggest problems in twin-engine flying. No asymmetric thrust, no crazy yaw when you lose an engine, it just keeps flying straight like nothing happened. Sounds perfect, right? Well, not exactly, because somehow this brilliantly engineered airplane ended up being one of the most misunderstood and commercially disappointing twins Cessna ever built. If you like digging into weird aircraft decisions like this, subscribe. This channel lives on stories like these. So what went wrong? Why did a design this smart struggle to win pilots over? Let's talk about it. Alright, let's start with what made the Skymaster such a clever idea in the first place. If you've ever flown or even studied traditional twin-engine airplanes, you know the biggest challenge isn't just having two engines. It's what happens when you lose one. On a conventional twin, that loss creates asymmetric thrust. One engine is still producing power while the other isn't, and that imbalance tries to yaw the airplane hard to one side. Now you're fighting it with rudder, managing airspeed carefully, and making sure you identify the correct engine. It's a workload spike at exactly the wrong moment, and historically, it's been one of the biggest contributors to accidents in multi-engine flying. Cessna looked at that problem and took a completely different approach. Instead of mounting the engines on the wings like everyone else, they lined them up along the centerline, one in the nose pulling, one in the back pushing. It's a simple idea, but it changes everything. Because now if one engine fails, there's no sideways imbalance. Both engines are aligned with the aircraft's center, so you don't get that violent yaw. The airplane just keeps flying straight. From the pilot's perspective, it behaves much more like a single-engine aircraft, just with reduced power. And in practice, it worked exactly as intended. Pilots would report that engine failures, especially of the rear engine, could be so subtle that they barely noticed at first. There was no dramatic kick or loss of control. The airplane stayed stable, predictable, and manageable. From a safety standpoint, that's huge. Cessna essentially removed one of the most dangerous aspects of twin-engine flying. For lower-time pilots stepping up from singles, this could have been the perfect bridge, giving them redundancy without the complexity and risk of traditional twins. But like most engineering solutions, it wasn't completely free of trade-offs. That rear engine sat in disturbed airflow, which made cooling more challenging. The design also required more complex control linkages because of the twin-boom tail, and maintenance access wasn't as straightforward as a standard wing-mounted engine. Still, none of those drawbacks take away from the core idea. The push-pull configuration was genuinely innovative, and it solved a real, well-known problem in a clean and effective way. On paper, this airplane should have been a massive success. It made twin-engine flying safer, easier to handle, and more forgiving. But aviation isn't just about what works on paper. It's about what pilots trust, what they understand, and what feels right when they're in the cockpit. And that's where things started to go sideways. Here's the part that really hurt the Skymaster, and it had nothing to do with whether the airplane worked or not. It was all about how pilots perceived it. Because even though the design solved a major problem, it also took away something pilots were used to relying on: feedback. In a conventional twin, when an engine fails, the airplane tells you immediately. You feel the yaw, you feel the imbalance, and your training kicks in almost instinctively. That physical feedback is a big part of how pilots identify and respond to engine failures. The Skymaster didn't do that. Because both engines were aligned along the centerline, losing one didn't create that obvious sensation. There was no strong yaw, no dramatic shift in handling. And while that made the airplane easier to control, it also made it harder to detect what was happening in the moment. So instead of feeling the problem, pilots had to look for it. They had to monitor gauges, listen for subtle changes in sound, and stay ahead of the airplane in a different way. That required a shift in mindset, and not everyone was comfortable with that. In some cases, this even led to confusion. If a pilot misidentified which engine had failed and shut down the wrong one, the situation could quickly become serious. That kind of scenario didn't happen because the airplane was poorly designed. It happened because the usual cues pilots relied on weren't there. Then you add in the human element. Many experienced pilots simply didn't see the need for the Skymaster's design. They were trained to handle asymmetric thrust and took pride in that skill. To them, the Skymaster felt unnecessary, maybe even a little unconventional for the sake of it. And perception matters more than people like to admit. The Skymaster looked different, sounded different, and flew differently. It didn't fit neatly into what pilots expected a twin to be. On top of that, it attracted a lot of lower-time pilots stepping up into multi-engine aircraft. That wasn't a bad thing in itself, but it did affect the airplane's reputation. When incidents happened, people didn't always separate pilot experience from aircraft design. The narrative started to shift. And once that kind of reputation takes hold, it's hard to shake. So even though the Skymaster was engineered to be safer and more forgiving, it ended up being seen as unfamiliar and, in some cases, misunderstood. And in aviation, if something doesn't feel right or doesn't inspire confidence, pilots tend to walk away from it. Now, this is where the Skymaster starts running into trouble in a way that really matters to buyers. Not in theory, but in how it actually stacks up against other airplanes people were considering at the time. Because when someone is shopping for an aircraft, they're usually not just looking for something interesting or different. They have a mission in mind. Maybe it's fast cross-country travel, maybe it's hauling people and bags, or maybe it's getting decent performance without burning a ton of fuel. And when you line the Skymaster up against its competitors, it doesn't clearly come out on top in any of those areas. If you were leaning toward efficiency, there were lighter twins that simply did the job better. They could carry similar real-world loads, cruise at competitive speeds, and do it while burning less fuel. For pilots who cared about operating costs and practicality, those airplanes made more sense. If your focus shifted towards speed and performance, then the Skymaster started to feel a bit underwhelming. There were other twins that were faster, more aerodynamic, and had a stronger reputation as serious traveling machines. For buyers spending that kind of money, performance wasn't just a bonus, it was part of the appeal, and the Skymaster didn't fully deliver on that front. Then there's the comparison that probably hurt it the most: high-performance singles. Airplanes like the Cessna 210 offered a very similar travel capability with less complexity. You still got solid speed, good payload, and a proven platform, but without the added cost and maintenance of a second engine. So for a lot of pilots, the question became pretty straightforward. Why deal with the extra expense of a twin if a single can accomplish the same mission? That's where the Skymaster ends up in a difficult position. It isn't the most efficient option, it isn't the fastest, and it isn't the simplest. Instead, it sits somewhere in between, which sounds fine at first, but in a competitive market, being in between usually means getting overlooked. Even when you look at range and endurance, the numbers often come with compromises. You can stretch it out for longer flights, but that usually involves slowing down and limiting payload, which takes away from its practicality as a real-world traveling airplane. So what you end up with is an aircraft that works well, flies safely, and offers something unique, but doesn't clearly win when a buyer decides what matters most. And the moment someone prioritizes speed, cost, payload, or simplicity, there's almost always another airplane that does that one thing better. If the performance issue made the Skymaster harder to justify, the way it was positioned in the market made it even harder to understand. Cessna introduced it as a safer, simpler twin, an airplane designed to make multi-engine flying more accessible, especially for pilots coming from single-engine backgrounds. The idea was to remove the intimidation factor of asymmetric thrust while still offering the redundancy of two engines. From an engineering and safety standpoint, that logic holds up, but the problem is, that's not necessarily what most twin buyers were looking for. For many pilots, stepping into a twin wasn't just about safety. It was about capability, speed, and a certain level of prestige. A twin-engine airplane represented an upgrade, not just in redundancy but in performance and presence. And when those buyers looked at the Skymaster, it didn't fully align with that expectation. It didn't feel like a clear step up in the way other twins did. At the same time, pilots who were perfectly comfortable with high-performance singles saw the Skymaster differently. From their perspective, it introduced more complexity, two engines to manage, higher maintenance costs, and increased operating expenses, without offering a dramatic improvement in what the airplane could actually do for their typical missions. So instead of appealing strongly to one group, it ended up sitting in the middle, trying to attract two different types of buyers without fully satisfying either. That lack of a clearly defined role made it difficult to market. It wasn't obvious whether it was the best choice for efficiency, speed, hauling, or simplicity. It was presented as a clever alternative, but buyers at this level usually aren't looking for alternatives. They're looking for the right tool for a specific job. Even its 6-seat configuration added to the confusion. While it technically had the seats, real-world payload limitations meant it didn't always perform like a true 6-person traveling aircraft. For buyers expecting that level of capability, the reality didn't always match the expectation. In the end, the Skymaster wasn't rejected because it was flawed. It struggled because people didn't clearly understand where it fit. And in aviation, if an airplane doesn't have a well-defined mission in the minds of buyers, it becomes very easy to pass over in favor of something that does. At the end of the day, the Skymaster didn't fail because it was a bad airplane. It failed because it walked into a market where every direction you looked, there was something that did a specific job better. And in aviation, that's all it takes. If a buyer wanted efficiency, there were lighter twins that burned less fuel and delivered cleaner numbers for real-world trips. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, they just did the job in a straightforward, predictable way, and that mattered to owners watching operating costs. If the mission shifted toward speed and status, then the Skymaster had an even tougher fight. Airplanes like the Baron or the Cessna 310 didn't just offer better performance, they carried a reputation. They looked fast, felt fast, and delivered the kind of numbers that made pilots feel like they were stepping up into something serious. When you're writing a check for a twin, that perception carries a lot of weight, and the Skymaster never quite matched it. Then you had the heavy lifters. If someone needed to carry people, bags, and full fuel without constantly doing weight and balance math gymnastics, there were airplanes built specifically for that job. They weren't always the fastest, but they owned that mission completely. The Skymaster, on the other hand, could do a bit of everything, but it didn't dominate in payload the way those airplanes did. And maybe the most damaging competition didn't even come from other twins. It came from high-performance singles. Airplanes like the Cessna 210 offered a similar travel experience with far less complexity. One engine, lower maintenance costs, simpler ownership, and still capable of carrying a family and covering serious distance. For a lot of pilots, that comparison was hard to ignore. So now imagine you're a buyer standing on the ramp looking at all these options. If you care about efficiency, there's a better choice. If you care about speed and image, there's a better choice. If you care about hauling capability, there's a better choice. And if you just want a practical traveling machine without the headaches of a twin, there's definitely a better choice. That's the position the Skymaster found itself in. It wasn't losing in one category. It was losing in all of them, depending on what the buyer valued most. And because it didn't clearly win anywhere, it became easy to overlook, even if it was technically impressive. Once that happens, sales start to slip. Production numbers drop, support becomes harder to justify. And eventually the airplane gets squeezed out, not because it didn't work, but because it couldn't outshine the competition in a way that made buyers choose it without hesitation. So yeah, the Skymaster wasn't a failure because it was flawed. It was a failure because it was different in a world that didn't really reward different. It solved a real problem, flew great, and did exactly what it was designed to do. But at the end of the day, pilots didn't fully trust it, buyers didn't clearly understand it, and the competition just kept outshining it where it mattered most. And that's the lesson here. Being innovative isn't always enough. In aviation, you've got to be clear. You've got to fit a mission, and you've got to give people a reason to choose you without hesitation. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know down in the comments. Would you actually fly a Skymaster, or are you sticking with a conventional twin? Alright, I'll catch you in the next one. Stay safe and keep the blue side up.